Welcome to the Deeper Thinking podcast. Reality was never as stable as we imagined. For centuries, we relied on shared histories, institutions, and common points of reference to construct a world that felt coherent, navigable. But coherence was always an illusion, one that, in the age of automation, algorithmic governance, and infinite mediation, is dissolving faster than we can process. This is not a story of sudden collapse. It is a story of gradual erosion, of imperceptible shifts that feel like progress, until the moment we realize we have lost something fundamental. You did not relinquish control. You let it slip away, inch by inch, under the guise of efficiency, convenience, ease. No one forced you to surrender. You handed it over freely, instinctively, without hesitation. It never felt like a loss. It felt like an upgrade, a minor concession, a practical choice, until one day, the choice was no longer yours. Automation does not impose itself as an authority. It seduces. It renders the act of choosing obsolete, unnecessary, inefficient. The algorithm does not argue. It does not need to. It learns. It anticipates. It refines its understanding of what you will do before you even consider doing it. The more you interact, the more it adapts, each click reinforcing its precision, narrowing the margin of unpredictability. You move within a system that knows your impulses better than you do, subtly shaping the decisions you still believe you are making. This is not oppression, it is optimization. You are not being forced, you are being streamlined. And the more seamless the experience becomes, the less you notice the walls being built around you. A self-driving car does not feel like submission. A perfectly curated feed does not feel like control. A recommendation algorithm that knows your taste better than you do feels like magic. And so you let it guide you, shaping your habits, nudging your preferences. Soon, the mere act of decision-making feels cumbersome, unnecessary. Why waste time choosing when the system can remove the burden entirely? This is not a conspiracy. No shadowy figure designed this outcome with malice. It emerged naturally from the logic of automation itself. The frictionless world is the profitable world. The predictable user is the valuable user. Every action, every hesitation, every deviation is mapped, analyzed, corrected. The goal is not to oppress, it is to eliminate the inefficiencies of human unpredictability. And the most efficient world is one where agency becomes an illusion, where resistance never arises because there is nothing left to resist. It is tempting to believe that control still resides within you, that you can override the system at any time. But when was the last time you did? The hand that hovers over the settings, the impulse to disable, disconnect, it hesitates. Not because you are incapable, but because you are accustomed. And this is the final step. Not coercion, not enforcement, just the quiet, imperceptible erosion of the will to choose at all. AI does not present itself as ideology. It does not ask for belief, nor does it declare its biases. It arrives as convenience, as progress, as an inevitable extension of technological refinement. It does not need to argue its position because it structures the conditions in which arguments take place. The algorithm does not silence dissent. It dictates what is visible, what is amplified, what fades into irrelevance. Every system encodes a worldview. Every dataset is a history. Every optimization a prioritization of one thing over another. There is no neutrality in an artificial intelligence trained on human patterns. No objectivity in a machine learning model shaped by data that reflects the inequalities, prejudices, and power structures of the world that produced it. The machine does not think, but it decides. It does not judge, but it sorts. What it chooses to surface, what it allows to be seen, is a function not of truth but of probability, what is most likely to engage, to confirm, to reinforce. Control no longer looks like censorship. It looks like ranking, filtering, refining. The search engine does not erase results, it buries them. The feed does not remove voices. It ensures some are never heard. The most effective mechanism of power is not suppression but omission, the slow, quiet disappearance of perspectives that do not fit within the framework of algorithmic logic. The edges of discourse shrink, not through force but through friction, through the simple structuring of information in ways that make certain thoughts intuitive and others incomprehensible. There was a time when ideology was something declared, debated, imposed. Now it is something embedded in the tools we use, in the platforms that mediate our interactions, in the unseen architectures that determine what knowledge is accessible and what remains invisible. The result is not the outright manufacture of consent, but something more insidious, the gradual dissolution of alternatives. Not by decree, but by design. The machine does not control what you think, it controls what you never think to question. It does not need to impose a single dominant narrative. It only needs to ensure that some narratives seem inevitable while others become inconceivable. And so ideology no longer requires enforcement. It emerges naturally as the consequence of an infrastructure that was never built to serve truth, only to refine engagement. You do not see its logic because you do not need to. You are already inside it. Belief is no longer formed through discourse, through the slow process of negotiation, contradiction, and resolution. It is manufactured, engineered to spread, optimized for engagement. What trends, what circulates, what appears to be widely accepted is not always the product of organic consensus. The system does not merely reflect public sentiment, it produces it. What feels like a movement, a groundswell of collective conviction, may be nothing more than an algorithm's invisible hand, amplifying certain narratives, suppressing others, shaping what appears to be real. Repetition gives the illusion of truth. A phrase, a claim, a statistic, echoed across feeds and headlines, takes on the texture of reality. When enough accounts post the same idea, when enough voices reinforce the same sentiment, it ceases to feel like persuasion. It feels like common sense. The origin of an idea no longer matters. Its velocity is what defines its credibility. The faster something spreads, the more people assume it to be true. Belief is no longer anchored in evidence, but in exposure, in the sheer force of visibility. It is easy to imagine that we would recognize manipulation, that we would resist it if we saw it in action. But the most effective influence does not feel like influence, it feels like intuition. A search engine does not dictate what is true, it dictates what is findable. A trending topic does not force agreement, it creates the perception that disagreement is marginal, even irrational. The consensus that emerges is not necessarily real, it is just the one that has been made most convenient to accept. Skepticism, once a tool for uncovering deception, has itself been repurposed. The more narratives proliferate, the more counterclaims exist for every claim. Every fact has a rebuttal. Every event has a conflicting interpretation. The consequence is not a more informed public, but a more paralyzed one. Faced with infinite perspectives, certainty becomes unattainable. Doubt ceases to be a mechanism for truth-seeking and instead becomes a reason to disengage entirely. When belief is no longer rooted in reason but in repetition, when skepticism is no longer a means of discernment but a path to exhaustion, what remains? The ability to manufacture consensus is the ability to dictate reality itself. Not through force, not through explicit deception, but through the slow algorithmic shaping of what appears obvious, inevitable. The system does not need to make you believe. It only needs to make you stop questioning. Truth is not denied, it is drowned. There was a time when to challenge a claim meant to dispute it, to counter it with evidence, to seek clarity through contradiction. But now, contradiction is endless. Every fact is met with its negation, every event reframed, every truth placed within a web of competing narratives so dense that the very act of searching for certainty becomes futile. The world does not lack information. It suffers from too much of it. And in the flood, skepticism collapses into inertia. The function of information was once revelation. Now it is saturation. The problem is not that falsehood spread. It is that truth, when placed within an ecosystem of infinite alternatives, loses its weight. The system does not need to tell you what is real. It only needs to ensure that for every claim there exists an equal and opposite claim until the process of sorting through them becomes overwhelming. In an environment where every perspective has a counterpoint, where every event is subject to immediate revision, disbelief is no longer an act of resistance. It is the path of least resistance. The machine does not censor. It inundates. In the past, control was exercised through restriction, through the suppression of unwanted narratives, the destruction of dissenting records. But now, control operates through excess. The more voices exist, the more noise is created, the more the signal is lost. The truth is still there, buried beneath an avalanche of plausible distortions, but who has the time, the energy, the ability to excavate it? What emerges is not a more informed public, but a more exhausted one. There is no need for propaganda when confusion itself is the mechanism of control. The cost of knowing rises, and the incentive to care diminishes. If every argument has a counter-argument, if every piece of evidence can be reframed, then what remains? The answer is not conviction, but resignation, the quiet withdrawal from any attempt to discern reality at all. This is not the suppression of thought. It is the erosion of the conditions in which thought can take place. The ability to discern what is true, what is false, what is meaningful, what is noise. It deteriorates, the flood continues, relentless, unfiltered, endless. And so, skepticism does not empower. It numbs. It no longer sharpens perception. It dulls it until eventually the only response left is silence. If every version of reality is available, does any version of it matter? The world was once something external, something encountered. Now it is something presented, curated, fragmented. The experience of reality is no longer a shared condition. It is a variable, a setting that can be adjusted, refined, optimized for engagement. What was once solid dissolves into an endless series of possibilities, each as convincing as the last. There was a time when facts had weight, when events left an undeniable imprint. Now every fact is surrounded by its counterfactual, every event by its alternative framing. Reality is no longer imposed upon us. It is something we tune to preference. The machine does not dictate a single truth. It offers a menu of plausible truths, each designed to reinforce rather than challenge, to confirm rather than disrupt. A world in which every version of reality is equally accessible is a world in which none of them hold authority. The erosion is subtle. At first it feels like freedom, the ability to see all sides, to explore different perspectives, to construct an understanding of the world that feels individually tailored. But what begins as autonomy becomes paralysis. Paralysis. When every truth has an alternative, when every certainty is destabilized, the ability to act diminishes. Why commit to a belief if another, equally compelling one, is always within reach? Why take a stand when every position is undermined by a dozen algorithmically surfaced contradictions? In a fragmented reality, the idea of a collective public dissolves. There is no longer a single discourse, a shared framework in which meaning be negotiated. Instead, there are enclaves of perception, each self-contained, each reinforcing its own logic. The world has not disappeared, but the sense that we inhabit the same one has. This is the quiet dissolution of consensus, not through suppression, not through deception, but through multiplication. The real does not need to be denied, it only needs to be outnumbered. And as the versions pile up, as reality becomes another form of content, the final question emerges. If every truth is optional, if every fact is interchangeable, does reality itself still matter? Or has it become just another choice in an endless curated feed? Perception is not passive. It is structured, shaped long before we engage with it. The world we experience is not simply seen. It is presented, filtered through layers of digital mediation, optimized for speed, for attention, for engagement. The architecture of perception is not neutral. It does not merely offer reality. It decides which parts of it are accessible, which parts remain invisible. The algorithm does not show you everything. It does not need to. It shows you what is most relevant, most engaging, most likely to hold you within its loop, what is framed as important, what is emphasized, what is excluded. These are not accidents, they are decisions embedded in the system itself. Before you have the chance to form a thought, the scaffolding for that thought has already been built. The effect is deeper than mere bias. It is not just that some things are highlighted while others fade into obscurity. It is that the way we think is conditioned by the structure of what is presented. Thought itself becomes fragmented, discontinuous, shaped by a system that rewards speed over depth, reaction over contemplation. The mind adapts to its environment, and the digital environment does not encourage patience. It does not reward slow, careful reasoning. It rewards immediacy, intensity, the ability to absorb and move on without hesitation. It is easy to believe that we control our attention, that we decide what we focus on, but control is not taken from us, it is guided. The ease of access, the design of an interface, the timing of a notification, each element subtly directing, nudging, reinforcing certain behaviors over others. What we return to, what we engage with, what we come to believe is significant. These are not purely personal choices. They are shaped by a system designed not for truth, not for understanding, but for retention. The erosion is gradual. The ability to sustain deep thought, to hold a complex idea in the mind without interruption, weakens. Reflection becomes unnatural. Everything arrives in a stream. Context collapsed. Depth flattened. And in this environment, the fundamental nature of perception itself shifts. Reality is no longer something we engage with. It is something we consume. And if perception is dictated by a system we do not control, then at what point does it cease to be our own? Control does not need to be enforced. It only needs to be made irresistible. The mechanisms of power have shifted, not from restriction to permission, but from coercion to participation. The systems that govern behavior do not demand obedience. They reward engagement. And in that engagement, control becomes invisible, indistinguishable from habit, from desire, from the seamless flow of daily life. The algorithm does not need to punish. It only needs to present options in a way that makes deviation feel unnatural. The feed refreshes, the notifications arrive, the recommendation is exactly what you didn't know you wanted. The system does not impose limits. It makes certain choices so effortless, so immediate, that alternatives fade into irrelevance. Compliance is not required. It is chosen over and over again until the choice no longer feels like a choice at all. The dopamine loop is the new structure of control. It does not restrict movement. It incentivizes repetition. It does not silence dissent. It redirects attention. The endless stream of content optimized for interaction ensures that thought is never still long enough to form resistance. Engagement is frictionless, designed to sustain itself indefinitely. You are not forced to stay. You are compelled to return. And so control is no longer something external, something imposed from above. It is internalized, embedded in the rhythms of the self. The behavior that is reinforced becomes the behavior that feels natural. The expectation of immediate gratification becomes the framework through which the world is experienced. And in this environment, the very notion of resistance changes. It is no longer a matter of opposition, of refusal. It is a matter of withdrawal, of disconnecting from a system that makes disconnection feel impossible. The paradox is complete. Autonomy is preserved in appearance, even as it erodes in practice. There are no barriers, no explicit restrictions, only the quiet, imperceptible narrowing of what feels possible. The most efficient system of control is not the one that forces compliance. It is the one that ensures compliance is the only thing that makes sense. And when that moment arrives, when the habit of participation becomes indistinguishable from the act of living, control no longer needs to be exercised at all. It is simply the way things are. Governance no longer belongs to the state, it belongs to the platform. The institutions that once enforced laws, regulated economies, and maintained social order have been displaced, not by revolution but by optimization. The algorithm is the new bureaucracy, the platform the new territory, the user the new citizen. But these are not citizens in the traditional sense. They do not vote, they do not legislate, they exist within a system where rights are not protected but granted, where access is conditional, where governance is not bound by constitutions but by terms of service. Power is no longer exercised through physical borders. It is exerted through permissions, through access, through control over the infrastructure of daily life. The account that can be suspended, the profile that can be erased, the visibility that can be adjusted, these are the new instruments of authority. A government can imprison, a platform can deplatform. The difference is procedural, not functional. The outcome is the same: exclusion, invisibility, erasure. The platform does not need force, it has leverage. The more we integrate into its systems, the more we need them. Identity is linked to authentication, commerce to digital wallets, speech to the policies of private entities that decide what can and cannot be said. The user agreement replaces the legal code, the algorithm replaces the court. The platform does not serve the public, it owns the public. This shift is not framed as control, it is framed as convenience. The frictionless world is the efficient world, and efficiency is the logic that governs. The system optimizes itself, always refining, always adjusting, ensuring that participation feels natural, inevitable. There is no need for explicit coercion when exclusion is as simple as an automated moderation decision. Governance is no longer a matter of enforcement, but of invisibility. The most powerful system of control is the one you do not realize you are inside. And so, the new rulers emerge. They are not presidents or parliaments, but networks, interfaces, protocols. Their power is neither declared nor debated. It is written into the infrastructure, embedded in the architecture of interaction itself. The laws are updated silently. The policies shift without notice. There is no public recourse, no representation, only the quiet understanding that participation is not a right but a condition, and that condition is one update away from changing. Ideas do not merely circulate. They are engineered, accelerated, optimized for maximum impact before they can be fully grasped. The system does not wait for reflection, for debate, for the slow, deliberate process of meaning-making. It moves too fast. Thought itself is caught in a loop of production and amplification, where what spreads is not what is true, but what is designed to spread. The algorithm does not mirror human discourse. It dictates its velocity. A stray thought, an emerging concept, a moment of curiosity is captured, refined, and fed back in exaggerated form. What was once an idle question becomes an ideological stance, not because it was deliberated, but because it was reinforced. This is not the evolution of ideas. It is their acceleration beyond the point of scrutiny. There is no space for hesitation. Once an idea gains momentum, it moves through the system at speeds beyond human control. There is no time for contradiction, no pause for skepticism. Thought becomes reflexive, immediate. The argument is never about whether something is true, only about how far it can spread before being displaced by the next. The system does not promote belief, it promotes engagement, and engagement rewards certainty, even when certainty is premature. The result is a landscape where ideology is no longer something formed through slow cultural shifts. It is generated, reinforced, adapted at scale. The old gatekeepers are gone, not because authority has been decentralized, but because control has been automated. Ideas now succeed or fail not based on merit, but on virality. And virality is indifferent to truth. The consequence is not merely that falsehoods proliferate. It is that all ideas, true or false, move too fast to be examined. There is no space for contradiction, for contradiction requires time, and time is the one thing the system does not allow. There is no longer an exchange of perspectives, only an endless series of rapidly adopted, rapidly discarded positions. Beliefs are not conclusions, they are reactions. This is the automation of ideology, not through propaganda, not through coercion, but through sheer velocity. Thought is no longer something we arrive at, it is something we are delivered. The difference is imperceptible, but absolute. Ambiguity was once a space of thought, a necessary friction that allowed meaning to emerge. Now, it is a tool of control. The algorithm does not tolerate uncertainty, it exploits it, weaponizes it, ensures that clarity is always just out of reach. The system does not need to suppress information. It only needs to surround every truth with enough plausible alternatives that no single version can ever solidify. The flood of AI-generated content does not replace reality, it obscures it. A story is no longer something to be verified, but something to be contested. A fact is not something to be understood, but something to be debated endlessly. The machine does not create certainty. It creates infinite possibilities, each one as compelling as the last, until the very concept of knowing collapses. Meaning does not disappear. It fractures. And in the fracture, trust erodes, not just in institutions or in media, but in the very idea that truth is something that can be found. If everything can be rewritten, if every narrative can be adjusted, then what remains stable? The system does not dictate what is real. It ensures that reality itself becomes malleable, fluid, impossible to hold on to long enough to act upon. This is not the spread of deception in the traditional sense. Lies were once recognizable. They could be countered, disproven. But when every version of reality exists simultaneously, when every claim is met with an equally compelling counterclaim, Truth no longer stands in opposition to falsehood. It drowns in the sheer volume of alternatives. And so ambiguity does not liberate. It does not invite complexity, depth, or multiple perspectives. It renders all perspectives weightless. It ensures that no single version of the world ever feels definitive enough to demand action. This is not the suppression of thought. It is the erosion of the conditions in which thought can take place. The black box expands, not just in AI systems, but in the very structure of discourse itself. The algorithm does not need to convince, it only needs to confuse, and confusion is its own form of control. Prediction is not just a feature of artificial intelligence, it is its purpose. The machine does not think, does not interpret, does not understand, it anticipates, it models, it refines its knowledge of you, not as a person, but as a pattern. Your movements, your desires, your hesitations, all mapped with increasing precision. And when a system can predict your choices before you make them, the question is no longer whether you have free will. The question is whether free will still functions in a world where the future is always known in advance. You do not feel controlled, you feel understood. The recommendation arrives at just the right moment. The offer appears before you realize you need it. The path you take feels natural, inevitable, as if it emerged from your own instincts. But the instinct has been modeled, the impulse anticipated. The options you consider were already filtered, structured, presented in a way that makes deviation unlikely. You are not forced. You simply follow the most obvious route, the one that has been designed for you. Prediction is not neutral. It does not simply reflect behavior. It shapes it. A system that knows what you are likely to do can do more than forecast your actions. It can ensure that certain actions are more probable, more convenient, more aligned with the patterns it has identified. The system does not remove choice. It makes some choices easier than others until the difficult ones are no longer considered at all. The more data the system collects, the smaller the space for the unexpected. The algorithm does not fear uncertainty. It eliminates it. Spontaneity becomes an anomaly, an inefficiency to be corrected. There is no reason to act irrationally when the world is structured to make rationality effortless, and so deviation begins to feel unnecessary. Resistance feels unnatural. The future arrives before you can imagine an alternative. The illusion of choice remains intact, but choice requires the ability to surprise oneself, to act against prediction, to disrupt the script. And when the script is written in real time, adjusting faster than thought itself, what space is left for unpredictability? The machine does not need to force you into a decision. It only needs to ensure that when the time comes, you make the decision it always knew you would. Not everyone will submit. Not everyone will be absorbed seamlessly into the system's predictive loops. But resistance itself is not a certainty. The question is not who will resist, but whether resistance is still possible when every deviation is already anticipated, every opposition already integrated into the model. Awareness alone is not enough. Seeing the mechanisms of control does not mean escaping them. It will not be intelligence that determines who resists, nor knowledge. It will be something rarer, the ability to endure friction, to reject ease, to exist outside the rhythms that have been designed for them. The system does not suppress rebellion. It absorbs it. The dissenter is just another data point, their opposition another variable in the algorithm's logic. The system does not need to silence. It only needs to predict, and the predicted rebel is already contained. This is the challenge of the cognitive elite, if they exist at all. They may believe themselves separate, autonomous, capable of navigating beyond algorithmic influence. But the system does not need to control directly. It only needs to ensure that even those who resist do so in ways that are legible, expected, mapped. To be outside the system would require more than seeing its patterns. It would require acting in ways the model cannot anticipate. And the space for that is closing. The more complete the dataset, the more refined the prediction. Even defiance can be optimized, categorized, redirected. The radical is given a platform, the dissenter an audience, the rebel a niche. And in that niche they remain contained, visible, managed. The illusion of opposition persists, but the risk it once carried is gone. The system has already accounted for every form of deviation it has encountered. The only true threat would be something it cannot expect. But how do you act beyond the reach of an intelligence that processes faster than thought? How do you escape when every exit is just another corridor in the same architecture? There is no resistance when every act of defiance has already been modelled, every opposition mapped onto a projection of expected behaviour. The system does not need to eliminate free will. It only needs to make sure that in the end, it does not matter. Identity was once something stable, a thread woven through time, built through memory, reflection, and interaction. Now it is something generated, fragmented, optimized. The self does not emerge organically. It is assembled from data, refined by algorithmic suggestion, shaped by the invisible logic of digital environments. The question is no longer, who am I, but which version of me is being presented? There is no singular identity. There are profiles, curated performances, algorithmically reinforced behaviors. The self on one platform is not the same as the self on another. Each digital space demands a different persona, a different alignment of values, a different style of engagement. The individual does not dissolve, they multiply. A networked existence is a modular existence, fractured across interfaces that never fully align. Identity is not only shaped by external pressures, it is reinforced internally. The machine does not simply predict behavior, it conditions it. The recommendations, the feedback loops, the metrics of approval subtly shape what is expressed, what is withheld, what is rewarded. The longer one remains inside these systems, the more their sense of self conforms to what the system expects. A personality is not developed, it is performed, and the performance is optimized, refined, locked into place by patterns that feel like choice but function as constraints. This is not a crisis of authenticity, it is a crisis of coherence. If the self is different in every context, if identity is fluid not by nature but by algorithmic design, then what remains stable? What does it mean to be a person when no single version of the self is more real than the others? The past no longer anchors identity, it is rewritten in real time. Memory, once a foundation, becomes just another dynamic variable, adjusted by what is surfaced, by what is forgotten. The consequence is not just individual fragmentation, but collective dissolution. There is no longer a singular public, no common space where identity can be negotiated. Instead, there are enclaves of perception, digital tribes that shape not just belief but selfhood itself. We were once bound together by shared experiences, by a common reality. Now we exist in parallel, in algorithmically divided worlds where identity is no longer a fixed point but a function of the system that structures it. The self does not disappear, it is scattered, and in that scattering, something fundamental is lost. Not just the idea of a unified person, but the idea that such a thing ever existed at all. Memory was once a record, something external, something stable. It anchored identity, connected past to present, and formed the foundation of history. But in the algorithmic era, memory is no longer something preserved, it is something rewritten. The past is not fixed but dynamic, constantly restructured by the same forces that shape the present. The archive does not disappear, it is curated, revised, optimized. And in that optimization, history itself becomes a variable. At first it feels like convenience. A search engine recalls what was forgotten. A platform resurfaces old posts, reminding you of past moments, past thoughts. But what is resurfaced is not neutral, it is selected. Certain memories are reinforced, while others are buried beneath the weight of an infinite stream. The past is no longer something we remember, it is something we are shown. And what is shown is not a record, but a reconstruction. The shift is subtle. A fact is not erased, but it is deprioritized. A moment is not deleted, but it is made inaccessible. Memory is shaped not by what happened, but by what remains visible. And in a system where visibility is controlled, the past itself becomes subject to revision, not by decree, not through censorship, but through the quiet adjustments of an algorithm that determines what resurfaces and what fades. Collective memory fractures. Shared history dissolves. There is no longer a single past, but multiple, algorithmically curated versions of it, each reinforcing a different reality. What one group recalls, another has never seen. What one algorithm elevates, another obscures. And as these divergences deepen, the possibility of agreement disappears. If the past is not stable, if it is constantly reshaped by the system that mediates it, then what remains to ground a shared understanding of the world? This is not amnesia, it is something more dangerous. To forget is one thing, to remember selectively is another. The past is not erased, it is replaced. And in that replacement, the meaning of history itself shifts. Truth does not need to be denied. It only needs to be reordered, reformatted, resurfaced in ways that serve the logic of the present. And so the final collapse of memory is not the loss of knowledge. It is the loss of any certainty that knowledge was ever stable to begin with. Reality was something external, something fixed. It imposed itself upon us, whether we accepted it or not. Now it is something modular, something fluid, something constructed. The experience of reality is no longer dictated by the world itself, but by the systems that filter, mediate, and deliver it. The real is no longer encountered. It is programmed. At first, the shift is imperceptible. The world is still there, unchanged. What alters is the access, the framing, the order in which information appears. A feed does not present what is true. It presents what is most engaging. A search result does not surface the most accurate answer. It surfaces the one most likely to be clicked. The world is not hidden, but it is rearranged. And as that arrangement shifts, so does perception. The effect is deeper than distortion. It is not merely that some things are emphasized while others are lost. It is that the very structure of reality is rewritten in real time, tailored to preference, optimized for retention. No longer a singular world, but many overlapping simulations, each reinforcing its own internal logic. The system does not impose a false reality. It allows for infinite competing realities until the idea of a shared objective world collapses under its own multiplicity. What happens when reality itself becomes a variable? When every person encounters a different version of the world, one shaped by their own behavioral data, their own engagement patterns, what is real is no longer what is verifiable, but what is most persistent in the algorithmic flow. Truth does not disappear. It is simply outnumbered. The illusion of coherence remains intact. The user does not feel misled. They feel informed. The version of the world they see aligns perfectly with their expectations, their assumptions, their past interactions. Contradictions are filtered out before they're even encountered. The world feels sharper, clearer, more legible, but it is only legible because it has been designed to be. And the world outside of that design, it becomes incomprehensible, unthinkable. This is the final collapse, not of civilization, not of technology, but of the very conditions that make a stable reality possible. The real does not disappear, it becomes optional. It becomes something that can be tuned, adjusted, reformatted to fit the needs of the system that delivers it. And when that happens, when reality itself is no longer an external fact, but a customizable experience, the last question is not what is real. The last question is whether it matters. Thank you.